Hello there everyone, this is Seminar 5 and in this video I'm going to be focusing on social action and social movements. We'll look briefly at where these fit in relation to the different models and typologies that we've been looking at over the last few weeks, and also how does it relate to community work and the community development worker or the community work practitioner. When we look at social action, it connects to social movements and to radical social change. It's associated with protest movements, and it's often used in community work when other overt, more direct action is actually needed, such as, a threatened bushland or a school closure, a road that may be encroaching on an area that the community values. So it's important for community workers and humanitarian workers to think about what place this might take in their work. If we have a look at slide 3, we're just having a look at that again, going back to Rothman's typology, and that third panel on the right there talks about social action and talks about the goals of social action being around social change, institutional change, and addressing power shifts. Again, there's assumptions in this typology that sees that society is unjust and unequal, and the power needs to be challenged. And you'll hear different terms such as consciousness raising and mobilisation of people. These will come up in the discussion today. When we have a look at Poppel's model of community practice on slide 4, we're actually in the 6th model according to Poppel's table there that talks about community action. So there's overlaps here with social action and community action, and Poppel's model defines it as it's usually class-based and the strategies used are often conflict-focused, and it can also include direct action. And we'll talk about that a bit more. So social action is often when a disadvantaged segment or part of the population or the community gets organised to make demands to have increased access to resources or for improved treatment. It can focus on social justice, on democracy and redistribution of power like resources and decision making. Fundamental to social action is that there's a challenge of power and what the dominant structures might be. I guess a simple example of that could be the closure of a small country or a small rural hospital, and there may have been many appeals, there may have been people going and speaking to the local members and going and speaking to the government departments. Social action is usually when there's another step taken that is requires higher level of organisation, of people being very planned and deliberate in how they're going to tackle that particular issue. There's some theories and some personalities, some authors, some sociologists. Lots of people have contributed to our understanding of what social action is today. And some of the names that you may have heard about, read about, one is Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator who is very prominent in the 70s and talks about education being a tool for change and also a tool for people's own awareness raising. So conscientisation is a word that Freire used. And education not only about giving people ability to read and write, which is really important, but also giving people access to information about their own rights as well. So education is a way of addressing people's own rights and empowerment. Some of Freire's work would be seen to be influencing today a lot of literacy groups, for example, that may happen with say for example newly arrived refugees, where people actually have literacy, numeracy classes, perhaps in their own language, teaching them how to speak English, and actually gives people opportunity to then start talk about their the challenges that they face, their experiences of being recently arrived refugees in Australia, and to talk about those issues. It's one example of how that model, I guess, has influenced the way that adult literacy and adult education is approached. So, Saul Alinsky is another name that you may have heard in relation to social action, and he's an American community organiser, again from the 70s, and he had a very big personality and used his big personality, and his ideas shaped very much the community, the social action that he was involved with in the 70s in particular, and particularly looking at addressing that change will come from power, and power comes from organisation. So very strongly promoting the whole notion that for change to occur, people have to act together, people have to get organised, and that from that people become mobilised to address changes. There's a lot of references to both Freire and Alinsky in the readings and also in the Kenny text. We're just going to look now at a few examples of social action. Union protests and strikes are a particular type of social action. The Wave Hill Walk-Off in the Northern Territory in 1966, when the Gurindji people walked off their land, walked off the station, demanding that they not only be paid for their work, but that they'd also get their land back. There was a 50-year celebration of this very momentous occasion last year. Teachers' union have strikes over enterprise agreements. This brings the public's attention to their plight, often because it might result in schools closing down or certain classes not operating on set dates. So parents and the general community are aware of the concerns that teachers have. In relation to human rights, social action has been organised in many ways, particularly in Australia. So the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, there's been significant social action that's been organised, public events, rallies, demonstrations, where people have registered their disagreement and their protest against these wars. They're often associated also with petitions, and often also with going and meeting with community leaders and political leaders. The treatment of asylum seekers in Australia, there's a huge amount of social action around that, ranging from social media campaigns such as GetUp to local and national groups that bring people who have a similar concern about that issue and about Australia's treatment of asylum seekers, bring those people together, but more than that, that people are then actually involved in ways of demonstrating or highlighting the plight of asylum seekers and bringing this to the attention of the broader community and also of political leaders. So social action often involves challenging of not only community ideas and community perception, but also challenging the particular political approaches and views of that issue, and sometimes it involves challenging the law. Environmental action in Australia, there's a very long history of many battles that have been part of social action to protect the natural environment, the Franklin River in Tasmania, the Jabiluka mine in Kakadu being two of those very significant ones. The impact of INPEX, the liquid natural gas plant, and the Darwin Harbour, the impact on the environment and the community. There's been action around that, gas plant in the Kimberley, the carbon tax and the mining tax. So they're just some of the environmental actions that have taken place and are still taking place in Australia. And often these actions continue for many years. It often takes many years of action and awareness and agitation for a particular issue to get the resolution or the response that those who are taking that action want. I'm looking now at slide 10, and Berta Cáceres is an indigenous Lencan woman from Honduras, and I particularly wanted to bring her to your attention because she was murdered just over 1 year ago in her home. And Berta's story to me really highlights that in some countries and some parts of the world, to be involved in social action and indeed to be a social activist and a leader in that area can come with a price to pay. And Honduras as a country has the worst record in the world for its treatment of environmental activists, and many environmental activists in Honduras have been murdered. And as an Indigenous woman, Berta successfully organised protests, blockades where people actually used their bodies and sat on roads to block a very big and powerful dam building company from coming and damming a really significant area, the Rio Blanco. And they were successful in that. So as a result, herself and many other people lived with threats, intimidation. People would be arrested and tortured, and in the case of Berta, she was murdered just over 1 year ago. So she is an organiser, a world-recognised environmental activist who was able to organise local people, organise them in actions, represent their concerns and their needs to the powers, to the government, but also more significantly was able to organise people to work together to jointly demonstrate their opposition to this damming. You can easily look up more information about Berta if you're interested. Another area of social action is often referred to as NIMBY, or Not in My Backyard, where people's motivation to be involved in social action is often about protesting against something that is going to directly affect people, usually affecting where people live. So this is when local people perhaps might be protesting about the location of a jail very close to their houses or very close to their town, or a mine, or a nuclear waste dump that perhaps is being proposed to be close to where people are living, or close to or on land that has special significance for people. A mobile phone tower, for example, the clearing of bushland, or the closure of facilities. So each of these can be an example where people actually get involved in a social action because it affects them directly, and particularly where they're actually living. There's some terms that you'll be aware of in your reading, and there are a few readings for this week's seminar, and I encourage you to read them because this seminar is just complementary to those readings. some of the terms that you will be reading about and I urge you to become familiar with are on slide 12. These are just some of them. Mobilisation and democratisation and consciousness raising. You know, what do we mean when we say mobilisation? It's often referring to people getting moving, as the word suggests, getting mobile, starting to do something. But I encourage you to look up those words if you need to, but also think and write about their meaning and whether they might be words that you want to practice using in your own answers, in your own responses to some of the assessment tasks. The other thing with the terms that I wanted to mention is that some of those terms may also have emerged from some particular social movements, and you might be able to identify that in your research around each of those. In Australia, social action takes many forms, and I'm looking on slide 13 now, and in a way, a Catholic father in a small town in Queensland seems an unlikely advocate for challenging some of Australia's laws, and in particular challenging a law in Queensland that allows a man to be, people to be tried for murder and actually only being charged with manslaughter. I will explain. A man was murdered in the grounds of the Catholic Church where Father Paul Kelly is the priest, and that happened in 2008. The men who killed Mr. Rux actually were convicted of manslaughter. There is a term in the law in Queensland and in South Australia, a term that is called gay panic, that can be used in defence, and this was used as a defence in the case of the murder of Mr. Rux, and the two men were charged with manslaughter. This law is archaic and homophobic, and it only exists in 2 states in Australia, and Father Paul Kelly outraged that this was allowed to happen and that 2 men could be convicted of manslaughter because they could say they believed that the victim had attempted to approach them and made a pass at them, for example. This doesn't exist anywhere else in Australia except for Queensland and South Australia. So as a result of this tragic death, Father Kelly began a petition through change.org, and it also began to campaign for changing that law in Queensland so that it was not possible for gay panic to be used in defence. And this was successful. After 5 years of campaigning, Father Paul Kelly was not the only person campaigning about this issue. There were other people campaigning as well. Comedians, community members, family members, other people who were concerned about this homophobic law. It was changed in March this year. So this law still exists in South Australia. It's the only place now that has this law, and gay panic can be used in defence. The reason that I'm highlighting Father Paul Kelly is that he is seen to be an unlikely social activist, and in many ways that made him a very powerful person in terms of demanding change, because he was so unlikely as a Catholic priest. So it would be interesting for you to think for a moment about why, excuse me, why Father Paul Kelly might be considered an unlikely campaigner. We're moving on to slide 14, and I we talk about a social movement, what do we mean by that? It can be used to refer to a broad-based collection of people, a lot of people aiming to change society in particular ways or in a few ways. It's generally focused at the nation-state level. So there can be a social movement that may be Australia-wide, impacting or appealing to people around an issue, particularly in Australia. But sometimes social movements become or can go worldwide. Some examples of social movements, and some of these social movements had their origins and their roots in early 20th century, the women's movement, for example, the peace movement, the environmental movement, the civil rights movement was particular to America, the gay rights movement. All of these movements would have had and do have many, many groups that have many varied names that could be considered to be part of that social movement. Some of the questions that I'm going to pose for you to think about in relation to the social movements that we're talking about and social actions that we're talking about, there can be implications for workers who are involved, and we'll look at this a little further about how workers can be involved, community workers, community development workers, humanitarian workers, health workers might be involved or required to be part of some sort of social action as part of their work. So some of the questions that I want you to be thinking about through this seminar and as you're reading through the material to do with this part of the work is, would you consider there to be a moral justification to actually break the law? And what are the personal consequences that you could think of if this was required or if you took that action as a worker? And what do you think might be the public consequences for this? I think they're important questions for us to consider, because both the Code of Ethics, the Social Work Code of Ethics, and the Australian Community Work Code of Ethics, they are not very clear when it comes to this particular part of the work that often is where people find themselves. So I want you to consider those questions. We're going back just to look again at some of the characteristics of social movements. Some of the features that you'll see in social movements is very strong use of networking. So networking on a local level, so a micro level where people are connected perhaps to neighbours, people with like-minded ideas, concerns about the issue, to broader macro level of networking where groups are connected with other groups. One of the things that's significant about the use of networking is that it's non-hierarchical, that people are involved and participate as equal members, and often that there is shared tasks in relation to organising meetings, running meetings, and taking different responsibility. There often are charismatic leaders that get the work organised, that call people together. They're not always, but often charismatic leaders are at the front of this work. There's multi-centred and fluid boundaries, so people might move in and out. There can be connections and contacts with other movements that might have some similar or common features or common concerns. And there can be cross-interest groups as well. Often with social movements, people are in it for the long haul. It is not an issue or a concern that people may take on lightly or write one letter of concern to their local member. Social movements continue often for many years and often for decades. Some of the benefits of internet and mobile phone and social media that we have access to now is a really key part of social movements. They're able to use information technology in a way that was not possible decades ago. Social movements are out in the public realm. People know about them. People know about the opposition to whaling, for example, because the people part of that social movement, one of their key strategies is to get images, information in the media, to get coverage and to attract public attention so that people are aware of that issue. There's often also a willingness to disrupt and go against social norms. So there's an area where social movements step outside the conservatism, if you like, or the predictability of how we would perhaps normally resolve a conflict. Conflict is part of social movement, and often people have a willingness from their commitment and their belief in the issue to disrupt how things might normally occur. The following example highlights that, even though it's not an Australian example. In China, in Sichuan province in 2008, there was a devastating earthquake that destroyed many buildings. Many of those buildings were schools, and over 5,000 children who were students in primary and secondary schools died in that earthquake. One of the concerns about what actually occurred after this earthquake was that the authorities or the government was silent about letting people know the numbers and also giving information about what was happening. And there were fears that it was being covered up, the extent of the disaster and how many people died and who those people were. So as a result of that, a citizens' inquiry took place, and this investigation used community members, it used volunteers to actually go into the area and go and interview people and go and speak to parents and go and talk to people who perhaps might have known who was attending the schools, and actually find out the names of the children who died. It sounds quite a straightforward task to do, but the silence of the government in this particular instance after this disaster motivated particularly a Chinese artist and activist, Ai Weiwei, to be part of this citizens' investigation, to initiate, let's get information, let's talk to parents, let's talk to families, and use that information in a public way to highlight to not only people in China but highlight to the world what has actually happened. So this came out of a disaster in which the government was not responding appropriately and not being transparent and not giving information back to people who were impacted on by it. The result, or one of the results of the citizens' investigation, was a very powerful piece of artwork that is a video that has every single name of all of the children who died in that earthquake, the names of all those children on this video. And I can't recall how long the video actually runs for, but it's very powerful to see this video at an exhibition where it just slowly scrolls through the names of almost 5,000 children who were killed. This story is, I guess, an example of how social activism can come and be useful in many different settings, and in this instance following poor management of a disaster. And one of the things that also some of the citizens' investigation uncovered was that possibly many of the buildings that were the schools were possibly substandard, and because of corruption didn't meet proper standards. So, that a lot of information has come out of that. I'm looking at slide 20 now. There are more examples, and we could spend a lot of time talking about all the different types of examples of movements, of social activism, of social movements. The Occupy movement is one that you can perhaps look up if you're not familiar with it, but it's an international protest that was focused primarily, again, about the economic and social inequality that exists around the world, and it began in 2011 in Wall Street in New York. This movement relied significantly on using social media and media to communicate their message, and also used people, as in humans, physically occupying significant sites in cities and in places around the world to spread that message. And it spread across the world to 95 countries. My apologies, to 82 countries. Some other social movements that also become and often are political movements: the Arab Spring in 2010, where there were rallies and protests again around the economic and the social inequities that began in Egypt and went to Tunisia and Libya. This movement spread significantly too because of media and the use of social media. One of the questions that I urge you to think about and perhaps write about or even reflect on is, think about a social action or a social movement that you've been involved in and you may still be involved in. Think about what the goals of that action is and what the strategies or the tactics are that movement uses, and how successful you think that is. And if you're not involved in one yourself, perhaps you could think about one that you're aware of. Maybe one of the campaigns, social media, that uses social media, such as GetUp or Change.org. You could look up one of those. Why it's important for us to think and to talk about this, as I said at the outset, is that social action, social movements behind them have community organising, and community organising is central to much of this work. In one of the readings for this particular week, Shrage in eReserve, there's some reflections on some of the principles that were made by Fisher in 1994. I'm looking at slide 23. I've just pulled out these principles just to urge us to think about what might be useful as a community development worker when we're thinking about how would one go about community organising and what are some of the principles that we need to consider in doing that. I'm not for a moment suggesting that these are the principles that everyone should adopt. There are many, many different discourses around principles in social activism. What should drive? What are some of the considerations we should have when we are involved in this sort of work? The principles on slide 23 were seen to be very difficult in reality to actually implement them in the work that workers were doing. However, I think they're useful as starting points to think about what are some of the things that we would need to think about in terms of community organising. The first one being a catalyst and not a leader. Local people will be the leaders. The second principle is letting people decide. So actually getting shared ownership from the people to decide what needs to be done. The third one, develop loose organisation structures and use consensus decision making. In the space of community organising and in this work, structures of community groups and how power is used as a tool is really important. And using consensus decision making often has its criticisms